Okay, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the humanitarian crisis in the Darien Gap. You've probably heard about this dangerous jungle crossing, but the 2024 ICRC Humanitarian Report on Panama, it really kind of brings the scale of this whole situation home.
Yeah.
It's pretty intense.
What really struck me about the report is that it doesn't just bombard you with statistics. It's more about the human cost of this migration.
Right.
And I think that's what we'll be focusing on today.
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
Those individual stories.
right off the bat, it hits you with this.
The work the ICRC is doing on the ground,
Yeah.
the difficulties they face in trying to provide aid.
Yeah.
It's such a challenging environment.
It is. It is. Right from the start, it hits you with this staggering statistic. Over 500,000 migrants crossed the Darien Gap in 2023. That's more than double the previous year and just exponentially higher than a decade ago. What's driving this massive surge?
It's a combination of factors, really.
Yeah.
You've got this ongoing political instability, the economic collapse in Venezuela, which has been a major push factor for years now. Then you add on top of that increased gang violence in Central America, the effects of climate change on agriculture.
Yeah.
And you have a perfect storm, forcing people to make these desperate choices.
So essentially, they're fleeing these impossible situations, and the Darien Gap becomes this necessary nightmare. Can you describe what makes this route so dangerous for those who might not have a clear picture?
Imagine like a 66-mile stretch of dense, untamed jungle straddling Panama and Colombia, and there are no roads, just treacherous terrain, swollen rivers, wild animals. The report uses the term green hell, which is
Wow.
a pretty accurate description.
Yeah, and the dangers go way beyond the environment.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
The report paints a very grim picture of the threats that migrants face on this journey.
Yeah, it's a lawless region, so it leaves migrants incredibly vulnerable to robbery, blackmail, sexual assault, and the lack of basic services. The exposure to the elements takes its toll. And tragically, many people, they don't make it.
Yeah. One of the most powerful parts of the report is when it shares the voice of Joel. He's a Venezuelan migrant.
Right.
And he says, to tell you the truth, 80% die and 20% live. It's the worst thing I've been through in my life.
Yeah, that quote really hits home the brutality of this journey. The report also talks about the psychological impact, particularly on children. Imagine witnessing death and decomposition. That trauma stays with them, long after they've left the jungle.
It's just, wow. Given all of this, where does the ICRC even begin to address a crisis of this magnitude?
Their role is critical, but it's multifaceted, providing on-the-ground aid, protection to migrants. But it's important to note that they neither encourage nor discourage migration.
Right.
It's strictly a humanitarian mission.
So they're meeting the immediate needs, but how does that translate on the ground? What kind of support are they actually offering?
Yeah.
One of their key programs is Restoring Family Links, or RFL. They offer free calls, charging stations, internet access, which might seem simple, but in this context, it's a lifeline.
Right.
Migrants are desperate to connect with family back home, and these services can be crucial if they go missing.
You can imagine the relief, hearing a familiar voice after that kind of journey.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, the report touches on the fact that women face unique challenges.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
So the ICRC organized this photo exhibition called Mother's Stories. It sheds light on the burdens women carry, not just their own belongings, but often children, the elderly, navigating this dangerous terrain. The exhibition really celebrates their resilience and sacrifice.
It's hard to fathom that strength. Sadly, as we've touched on, not everyone makes it out. What happens to those who disappear into the jungle?
That's where the ICRC's forensic expertise becomes really vital, working with local authorities to recover and identify remains, which is a daunting task in that environment. Advocating for the dignified treatment of those remains, and ultimately working towards returning them to families.
Achieving closure must be incredibly difficult, especially given the vastness and the inaccessibility of the Darien Gap.
It is. The report talks about this new humanitarian forensic mortuary. It has 100 individual chambers. Grim necessity, but it also demonstrates their commitment to providing some measure of dignity
Right.
to those who perish on this journey.
This all underscores the scale of this crisis. It sounds like the ICRC's work goes beyond direct aid.
Oh, for sure.
They're addressing the problem at a more systemic level, too.
Absolutely. One of the key aspects is promoting international humanitarian law and human rights standards. They collaborate with the Panamanian Red Cross, national authorities, pushing for stronger protection mechanisms.
Okay.
They even developed a university course on international humanitarian law. the first of its kind in Panama. It's about building a framework for greater respect for human life and dignity.
So they're not just putting out fires, they're trying to prevent them from starting in the first place.
It's a long game, for sure.
It is, it is.
They're looking at the big picture, understanding that a lasting solution requires tackling the root causes of this crisis. And that leads us to another area of their work that might surprise you: Latin American prison systems.
Oh, okay, I'm intrigued. What's the connection there?
Well, they're addressing humanitarian challenges within detention facilities, too. They have a project called CTIP, focuses on developing better prison infrastructure to create more humane and dignified conditions for detainees.
Wow.
They just finished the discussion phase and are moving into implementation, which is a huge step.
That's amazing. It's fascinating how they're connecting these seemingly disparate threads. You've got migration, detention, this overarching need for respect for human life.
It speaks to the complexity
And dignity.
and interconnectedness of these issues, and to the ICRC's holistic approach. They're not just treating symptoms, they're addressing the underlying causes.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground already, and it's a lot to process. Before we get lost in the statistics and the complexities, I think it's important to circle back to the human element. What are some of the ways the report brings those individual stories to life?
One of the most pregnant moments comes from Jennifer, a Venezuelan migrant. She says, "I think if you spoke to everyone who has been through it, you'd see that people have had very different experiences. Some people have had it worse. We may complain, but we made it out safely. There are some who had it worse."
Her words really make you pause and reflect.
They do, a stark reminder that within this massive crisis, there are countless individual journeys, each with its own unique challenges and triumphs.
And it compels us to consider, what if those who had it worse were our own family members, our friends, our neighbors?
Exactly. It's a question that forces us to confront our own empathy, our own responsibility. And it leads us to the crucial question of what more can be done.
That's a question we'll explore in more depth as we continue this deep dive. We've laid out the scale of the crisis, the dangers of the journey, and the work being done to provide aid. But we're only scratching the surface. There's so much more to unpack, particularly when it comes to potential solutions and the role we can all play.
Yeah, it's a question that really stays with you, doesn't it? What more can be done? Because it's not a simple fix. It's not just about closing borders or throwing money at the problem.
Exactly. We talked about those root causes, collapsing economies, violence, climate change. These are huge forces pushing people to risk everything. Where do you even begin to unravel something that complex?
The report really emphasizes international cooperation as like a key piece of this puzzle. The ICRC stresses the need for countries of origin, transit, and destination to work together, to share responsibility, instead of just passing the buck.
Yeah, because right now it feels like these migrants are falling through the cracks of a broken system.
It's about tackling those underlying issues driving migration within those countries, and collaborating on humanitarian aid and protection along the routes. No single nation can solve this alone.
And speaking of aid, the ICRC is clearly doing such vital work on the ground, but can they really make a dent in a problem this big, or is it just a drop in the bucket?
Well, they're absolutely essential, but you're right, they can't do it alone. They need adequate resources, access to the most vulnerable areas, and the political will of nations to back them up. And that's where awareness comes in.
Okay, so that brings us back to our listener. We've armed them with information, but what can they actually do besides just knowing about this crisis? Does awareness really translate into action?
It has to. Awareness is the spark. When you understand the human cost, when you connect with those individual stories, it can ignite empathy. And empathy is the fuel for action.
So what does that action look like in this case? Give us something concrete.
Well, there are several avenues. Supporting organizations like the ICRC is a direct way to make a difference. Donating, volunteering, amplifying their work through word of mouth or social media. It all adds up.
And on a larger scale.
We can advocate for policy changes. Contact your elected officials. Push for legislation that addresses those root causes we discussed, that promotes humane treatment of migrants at every stage of their journey. Raise awareness in your communities. Challenge those harmful narratives that dehumanize migrants.
It's about shifting the conversation from them to us.
Exactly.
Recognizing our shared humanity.
Instead of seeing this faceless mass, we need to remember Jennifer's words. There are some who had it worse. Each one of those statistics is a life, a family, a dream.
And it forces you to acknowledge the individual within the scale of the crisis.
Exactly, and it challenges us to ask, what if those who had it worse were our own loved ones? How would we want them to be treated? That question can be a powerful motivator.
Amidst all this heaviness, the forensic work the ICRC does gives me like a glimmer of hope. It's not just about identifying remains, but about restoring a measure of dignity to those who have been lost and providing closure for their families.
That aspect is so crucial and often overlooked. Imagine the agony of families not knowing the fate of their loved ones. The ICRC's work in recovering, identifying, and if possible, returning remains offers a sliver of peace in an otherwise unbearable situation.
It must be incredibly challenging, especially given the environment of the Darien Gap. Logistically, how do they even go about this?
It's a complex process, often involving meticulous searching, DNA analysis, collaboration with multiple countries. And yes, the environment makes it even more difficult. But the ICRC is pushing for better systems, for greater cooperation between nations, to streamline this process.
So even in death, there's this fight for dignity, for recognition.
Absolutely. It's about honoring those lives, those journeys. And it speaks to the ICRC's commitment that even amidst the chaos and suffering, they're holding on to that thread of humanity.
That brings us to another fascinating point in the report. The CTIP project, focusing on improving prison infrastructure in Latin America. How does that tie into the larger picture of the ICRC's mission?
It might seem tangential, but remember, it's all interconnected. By advocating for humane and dignified conditions within detention facilities, they're addressing another facet of this global system that's failing vulnerable people. Many of those detainees are migrants themselves, caught in this web of bureaucracy and hardship.
It's almost like they're weaving together these different threads of the human experience. Migration, detention, the universal need for dignity and respect.
Precisely, they're looking at the systemic issues that perpetuate suffering and pushing for change at every level. It's about creating a world where those forced to flee their homes are treated with compassion, not suspicion.
Okay, we've explored the depths of this crisis, the dangers of the Darien Gap, the multifaceted work of the ICRC. It can feel overwhelming, even paralyzing. What's the one thing you want our listener to walk away with, to hold on to?
Hope. Don't let the darkness of this situation extinguish the possibility of change. The ICRC's proof that even amidst despair, there are people fighting for a better future. We as individuals can be part of that fight.
It's easy to get caught up in just how enormous this crisis is and feel like any action we take is just a tiny drop in the ocean. But the work the ICRC is doing, the stories we've discussed, they remind us that those drops do matter.
I think so too, and what really strikes me about this report is not just the scope of their efforts, but their unwavering commitment. They're not just providing like Band-Aid solutions. They're really pushing for lasting change, even when progress is slow.
Yeah, it's not just about that immediate aid, it's about tackling those systemic issues. Like we talked about promoting international humanitarian law, working with governments, improving conditions, even training future humanitarians. It's a long game.
It is, but they're in it for the long haul.
They are.
And that's what gives me hope. Planting seeds for a more humane and just future, even in the middle of this challenging present. It's like they're saying, we're not giving up on humanity, and neither should you.
That's a powerful message. If our listener could take away just one thing from this whole deep dive, what would it be?
I think it goes back to what Jennifer said. There are some who had it worse. It's a reminder that within this massive crisis, there are individual stories, individual lives that deserve our attention and compassion. We can't allow ourselves to become numb to the statistics, to the headline.
Yeah, because behind each number there's a face, a name, a story of just unimaginable hardship and resilience.
Exactly.
And maybe even a flicker of hope.
So what can we do? We can support those organizations doing the hard work, like the ICRC, advocate for change, challenge the dehumanizing narratives, and most importantly, never stop seeing the individual.
Never stop seeing that human being behind the statistic.
Because that's where true change starts. With empathy, with understanding, with recognizing that connection we all share, and that the fate of one really does affect us all.
This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive. It's heavy, it's complex, but it's also a call to action. Thank you for guiding us through this difficult terrain, for helping us understand not just the challenges, but the possibilities for a better response to this crisis.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you leave feeling informed, inspired, and maybe even a little more hopeful, because even in the darkest situations, the light of human compassion can shine through